days before the primary here in New York. And this event will be recorded and available to viewers, listeners of WBAI and the Real News Network. I want to thank them both for being here. I'm Mark Crispin Miller. I'm a professor at New York University, and I'm very pleased to have been asked to moderate this event. And I think it's appropriate that I introduce it by recounting my own personal history with Scott Ritter, because that history is really quite relevant to what our guests are going to talk about tonight. I don't know if Scott will ever forgive me for this, but I'm actually responsible for introducing him to the public. In 1992, I was researching the first Gulf War, which most of the people in this room are old enough to remember. It didn't last very long, so it may be easy to forget by contrast with the war that's essentially still going on. I thought that the first Gulf War was a real propaganda masterpiece because there was a long buildup in the second half of 1990, leading up to the U.S. imposed deadline of January 15th, 1991. And throughout those months, the government, the military, repeatedly implied that that war was going to be a disaster comparable to Vietnam. I don't know if you remember this, but we kept hearing that Saddam Hussein has the world's 5th largest army, and there was all kinds of propaganda out there hyping the dangerousness of the Iraqi military. So everybody was kind of terrorized until the war started a day or two beyond the deadline, just to intensify the suspense a little more. Started at prime time, Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. And within hours, it appeared that the war had been won. How many of you remember this, right? Watching it on CNN, as we all did, we heard nothing but good news. That Saddam Hussein's Air Force had been destroyed on the ground, that his dreaded Scud launchers had mostly been destroyed. There were no American casualties. We heard this over and over again. Now, for the first 2 hours of the war, before we started to hear all that good news, there was all kinds of, there were many stories by CNN reporters, military bases, talking to terrified military wives, crying and hoping that their men would come home safe and sound. At 9 p.m., George Bush Sr. came on, a picture of calm and command, and spoke confidently about the righteousness of our cause and so on. And it was right after that that all the good news started to come in. So it really looked like he was somehow comparable to God himself, that he had willed this miraculous victory. All right, now this struck me as dubious, to say the least, so I started to research it. And providentially, my research assistant, Jeffrey Blitz, got in touch with Scott Ritter. And Scott told us that contrary to the contrary to the hype we were hearing night after night from General Norman Schwarzkopf, who would always list all the victories of that day, and kept repeating that we destroyed 11 mobile Scud launchers today, and then 13 more the next day, and then another 8 the next day. And if you added all the numbers up, it actually exceeded the number of Scud launchers that Iraq even possessed, right? Scott was able to tell us, based on firsthand experience, that they hadn't destroyed a single one, not one. So I wrote a piece about this for the New York Times op-ed page called Operation Desert Sham, and Scott was on the record. As I say, he may not forgive me for this, but that was the first time the American public had heard of him. He also gave us a tip, which we verified independently, about the death that first night of Colonel Scott Spiker, the pilot who actually perished during that first wave of attacks on Iraq. But that was suppressed for days because it would have messed up the narrative of perfect victory. So I and the American people both owe Scott Ritter a great deal just on that basis. But he went on, as I hope you all know, to make a genuinely heroic effort to avert the Second Gulf War, for which he paid dearly, because the whole establishment went after him. And at the risk of sounding self-promotional, but actually because I want people to know his story, I strongly recommend that you get hold of my book, Cruel and Unusual, which has a whole chapter meticulously tracking what happened to him after he made that effort to prevent that war. Now, it's appropriate that he's here to talk about the foreign policy views and attitudes towards war on the part of the two Democratic candidates who will, who are the main players in the primary this Tuesday. He has some personal experiences with Hillary Clinton that are very relevant and that people should know before they vote. I'm going to, even though I only just met Ray McGovern for the first time this evening, I want to take my hat off to him as well. He too has been a heroic fighter for peace, and also paid for this when he protested, peacefully protested a speech by Hillary Clinton. Was this 2011? He turned his back on her while she was speaking, and they dragged him out of the room and beat him up. He talked about it on Democracy Now! So, as I say, I'm honored to be here. That's my introduction. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Scott Ritter and Ray McGovern.
To be here tonight to speak with you. I'm going to do my best to discuss a difficult topic in a nonpartisan fashion. We're in the midst of a very partisan primary season. And on the Democratic side, we have two candidates who are about as different as one can get, especially when we talk about foreign policy. We have a candidate who is a former Secretary of State, former First Lady, who has a resume that one would think is ideal for the task of being Commander-in-Chief. And then we have another candidate, independent representative / senator from Vermont, with little or no foreign policy experience. And it seems it would be a slam dunk in favor of experience. We live in a difficult time. I'm not going to take us around the world. I'm going to focus on the Middle East and what I refer to as America's addiction to interventionism, regime change. Talk about 4 case studies: Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Iran. I'm going to start with Iraq because it sort of sets the foundation for the entire discussion of American intervention, at least the modern iteration of American intervention. And when I speak of Iraq, I'm not going to talk just in terms of what seems to be the greatest point of conflict between candidate Sanders and candidate Clinton. That is, their respective votes for war on Iraq in 2002. Bernie Sanders has famously said, "I voted against the war," and Hillary has infamously said, "I'm sorry for voting for the war." And one would say that seems to color the two candidates, but it doesn't. It's the situation in the story is much more complex than that, and I think that we owe it to ourselves to understand that. To understand what happened in 2002, we need to go back to 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Prior to the invasion in 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq had, in 1979, been placed on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Saddam Hussein was characterized as a rogue leader of a rogue nation who was pursuing weapons of mass destruction. So right there, you've got the three basic building blocks for American intervention. We tend to demonize a nation, delegitimize a nation by calling it a rogue state. Usually a rogue state led by a crazy dictator. And then we go further and say that this rogue state represents a threat to international peace and security, and indeed the entire world order, by speaking of the rogue state's links to terrorism, usually as a state sponsor of terrorism. And then we go further to create this nexus between terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. So now we have the ingredients of a global catastrophe. A rogue state that sponsors terrorism and possesses weapons of mass destruction. Now, this is a situation that was starting to bubble up in 1979, 1980, 1981. But suddenly the scenario became inconvenient, you see, because Iraq invaded Iran, and Iran started winning the war. And now we had a situation where another rogue state, this time the Iranians, were prevailing on the battlefield and threatening global supplies of oil. And so, with a magic wave of the wand, Iraq was no longer a state sponsor of terror. Saddam Hussein was no longer a rogue dictator heading up a rogue nation pursuing illegitimate weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein overnight became a close friend and ally of the United States of America. We started providing him with intelligence. We started providing him with hundreds of millions of dollars of agricultural loans that allowed him to reallocate funds to acquire the ability to build his conventional weapons capability and his unconventional, i.e. weapons of mass destruction capability. And this was all fine and dandy with the United States so long as Saddam was focused on holding off the Iranian Shia horde that was threatening to take over much of the Arab oil-producing world. And then Saddam invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. Now, to show you how crass and how arbitrary and capricious our foreign policy is, overnight, this good friend of America, who was receiving hundreds of millions of dollars of our money, who got away with using chemical weapons against the Iranians and the Kurds during this period of time, suddenly was retransformed into the ultimate bad guy. He suddenly became a state sponsor of terror overnight. Why? Because he supported the Mujahideen al-Khalq, an Iranian opposition group that operated on Iraqi soil fighting the Iranians. He'd been supporting them for a decade. But now this support, which we had turned a blind eye to, suddenly allowed us to say, no, you're a state sponsor of terror. He supported the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He supported the Abu Nidal organization. What's interesting about the Abu Nidal support is that actually his support comes at the end of a long and lengthy negotiation, which had Abu Nidal sent to Baghdad under house arrest. So Saddam actually was facilitating the bringing about stability in the Middle East by bringing Abu Nidal out of the operational circle where he could commit acts of terror and place him under virtual house arrest in Baghdad. Yet the fact that Saddam did that, the United States used an excuse to label him a state sponsor of terror. And then, of course, we have his weapons of mass destruction programs. Now, we fought a war against Saddam, but before we fought this war, this is the Gulf War, we had to take it a step further. You see, Saddam went from being somebody who could receive a notary such as Donald Rumsfeld, embrace him, and call him a true friend, and be called a true friend of America, to being somebody who was labeled as the equivalent of Adolf Hitler. If you remember, in October of 1990, then President George Herbert Walker Bush gave a speech in Cincinnati where he said that Saddam Hussein must be held accountable for his sin of invading Kuwait. And there must be Nuremberg-like retribution, referring to the Nuremberg trials, of course, which was the criminal prosecution of the Nazis of Germany in the aftermath of the Second World War. So in one fell swoop, Saddam Hussein didn't just become a rogue leader, he became the rogue leader. the modern-day equivalent of Adolf Hitler, who deserved Nuremberg-like retribution. Now, we fought this war. We weren't successful in getting rid of Saddam during this war. We were able to defeat the Iraqi army, but we were left with a situation where we had this dictator, whom we had demonized, who possessed weapons of mass destruction and was a state sponsor of terror, but he survived a war he wasn't supposed to survive. And what do we do about this? Well, there wasn't support for continuing military operations. A decision was made that we would contain Saddam through the vehicle of economic sanctions. And now we come to another one of these tools that you'll see pop up when we speak about American interventionism and regime change. Economic sanctions. Now, people call sanctions a policy. It's a tool of policy. I actually call it the tool of no policy. When you don't have a policy, when you don't have a viable policy, when you don't know what to do,
Sanctions.
you impose sanctions because it buys you time, ostensibly contains the problem until which time you can come up with a solution. But here the solution was Saddam Hussein would collapse from within. You see, we would impose economic sanctions, keep them in place until either he lost the confidence of his commanding generals, his economy collapsed, or something else happened to remove him. The CIA gave him 6 months to live after the war. But we needed a justification for these economic sanctions. They had been originally imposed because Saddam invaded Kuwait. They're supposed to be lifted when Kuwait is liberated, which it was in February of 1991. So there was no longer legitimacy for the continuation of these sanctions, but we had to create a new legitimacy. It was called weapons of mass destruction. And that's where the United Nations resolutions to disarm Iraq came into play. The resolutions were passed. Economic sanctions were linked to Iraq's willingness to comply with its obligation to disarm. So long as Iraq was found to be non-compliant, sanctions would be in place. Now, originally it wasn't supposed to be that complicated because the disarmament process was always going to take longer than 6 months. It was never about disarmament, ladies and gentlemen. It was always about containment. It was always about regime change. But Saddam fooled everybody by surviving longer than 6 months. And suddenly we were compelled to deal with the issue of how do we handle this man who we've called the modern-day equivalent of Adolf Hitler, who we say is a state sponsor of terror, and has weapons of mass destruction. What do? We didn't have an effective policy to deal with this. So we come to the next building block, the imposition of no-fly zones. You see, we sanction, and then the next non-policy is to create no-fly zones that limit the ability of a sovereign nation to operate within its own borders, to impose its will on its own people. We imposed one in the north to limit Saddam's ability to deal with the Kurdish population in the north, and we did one in the south to limit his ability to deal with the Shia population in the south. Again, we didn't do this because we really cared about the Kurds or the Shia. We did this because we cared about destabilizing Saddam Hussein by helping facilitate his demise and his downfall. Saddam surprised everybody by continuing to survive. Year after year, he survived. In 1996, then President Clinton, who inherited this policy from President Bush, and when he inherited, it's not as though he inherited sort of half-heartedly. When he was President-elect Bill Clinton in January, prior to his inauguration, he said, "I support this policy wholeheartedly, that the policy of the Bush administration on Iraq is my policy and will be my policy," and it was his policy. But it was a policy that was a non-policy. They didn't really know how to deal with Saddam. We sanctioned him, we have no-fly zones, but Saddam continues to survive. Now, what happens when politicians over and over and over again eat the red meat of interventionism? What is the red meat of interventionism? It's saying you have a rogue leader, a rogue nation. It's saying that they are state sponsors of terror. It's saying that they possess weapons of mass destruction. And then it creates a nexus that brings all of this together to create a threat, a fundamental threat to the security of the United States and the rest of the world. If you say this long enough, people start believing it. And when people start believing it, they start believing that something has to be done. And in 1998, this lack of policy solidified into a genuine policy that was put forward under the moniker of the Iraq Liberation Act. It started off as basically a policy statement by the leading conservative foreign policy minds, but it became the law of the United States. Why? Because the United States House of Representatives voted on it, and the United States Senate voted on it. Guess who voted for the Iraq Liberation Act in October of 1998? Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders bought into the red meat. Bernie Sanders publicly said that Saddam Hussein is a brutal dictator who should be removed. Now, when you say you have a brutal dictator who should be removed, what does that mean? It means just that, regime change. Everybody in the United States bought into this. Not every, I mean, you can point to an individual here and there, but the key players across the board said Saddam Hussein had to go. The problem wasn't so much the substance of the message. There was universal agreement that Saddam had to go. The problem was the process in getting rid of him. We still didn't quite know how that was going to happen. In December of 1998, when then President Bill Clinton started Operation Desert Fox, targeting Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program and running a covert coup attempt against Saddam at the same time, Representative Bernie Sanders stood up in the House and was opposed to it. Now, his speech in opposition, on one hand, doesn't make too much sense, when just 2 months prior he said, no, regime change is the policy of the United States. But now he's saying that we're bombing them, trying to get rid of them. This isn't right. See, Bernie was about process. He wasn't upset that we were bombing Iraq. He wasn't upset that we were targeting Saddam. He wasn't even upset that we were bombing sites ostensibly related to weapons of mass destruction, even though they weren't. He was upset that the president didn't go to Congress and get permission to do this. Now, this could be a criticism, but it actually says a lot about the man, because you can't condemn somebody for buying into the red meat. I'm here to tell you right now, you're not going to be a successful American politician if you swim against the current all the time. When you have the vast majority of the people embracing this formula of regime change, of interventionism, that's built upon the notion of rogue state, state sponsor of terror, weapons of mass destruction, it's hard to stand up and say, no, Saddam's not a rogue leader. I had a general once tell me, when I was explaining to him why I was right, he said, Ritter, when you're explaining, you're losing. And that's pretty much true. If you're a politician that has to be explaining to his constituency why Saddam Hussein's not as evil as everybody says he is, you're losing. If you're explaining why he's not a state sponsor of terror, you're losing. If you're explaining why his weapons of mass destruction programs aren't as dangerous as everybody else says they are, you're losing. But if you have the courage to stand up and say that the president is operating in a manner that violates the Constitution of the United States of America, you got a winning hand at that point in time. And Bernie was playing a winning hand in December of 1998. And the reason why I bring this up is that that moment, December 1998, Operation Desert Fox, directly segues into this important vote in October of 2002, the vote for the war in Iraq. Hillary Clinton, in justifying her vote for the war in 2002, pointed to what happened in December of 1998. She said, I supported Operation Desert Fox then, and I support it now. She said, my husband did a wonderful job bombing Iraq back then. He was justified then, and we will be justified doing it again today. He had weapons of mass destruction back then, and it was worthwhile bombing them. He has weapons of mass destruction today. Therefore, it's worthwhile eliminating this problem. The Iraq Liberation Act said we must remove Saddam, and now you have a President, George W. Bush, who is going to get rid of Saddam. Policies finally marrying up with the statements we had put out. The problem, though, is that none of the stuff that we said about Iraq, none of the stuff that was used to justify the war, was true. Saddam wasn't a threat worthy of war. He wasn't a state sponsor of terror. There was no nexus between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Al-Qaeda, an organization that was responsible for 9/11. And yet, who do we invade? Iraq. Now, what's the importance of this is it's not just a history lesson, because we have to understand that Iraq didn't happen in a vacuum. I mentioned 3 other locations where there's conflict. Libya in 2011. What happened with Libya? Muammar Gaddafi. What did we do to Muammar Gaddafi? We labeled him a rogue nation, a rogue leader. We labeled him a state sponsor of terror. We said he was pursuing weapons of mass destruction. Bill Clinton in 1996 spoke about the nexus between rogue states, weapons of mass destruction, state sponsor of terrorism, in picking on Libya. In 1996, we passed the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. Remember that word, sanctions, one of those tools. So we started sanctioning Libya. Libya got a little off kilter, though, because in 2002, Muammar Gaddafi took a look at what was happening in Iraq and said, I don't want that to happen to me. And so he said, guess what I'm going to do, guys? I'm going to voluntarily disarm. You can come in, you can get rid of my chemical weapons, you can get rid of all the stuff I have. I have a nuclear weapons program. You know what the irony of that nuclear weapons program was? There was no nuclear weapons program in Libya until we sanctioned them, until we isolated them, until we called them a rogue state, until we called them a state sponsor of terror. At that point in time, Libya said, okay, if that's how you're going to treat us, we're going to pursue a nuclear weapons program. And they did. They got caught, and Muammar Gaddafi decided to give it up. In 2011, when we finally started moving in on Libya militarily, we hadn't completed the disarmament of his chemical weapons. We hadn't completed the disarmament of his nuclear weapons program. This was still in play, and yet we got rid of him anyways. Here's a man who's cooperating with the international community to get rid of the weapons that we claim represent such a great threat. Here's a man whom the United States relied on. You know, one of the great ironies of the whole Libya debacle is that when the CIA started sending in their special activities guys to work with the opposition group on the ground, guess who they met coming out? The CIA guys who were on the ground training Muammar Gaddafi's security forces. So you had one group of CIA guys who were helping Gaddafi, leaving, as the other group of CIA guys who were going to get rid of Gaddafi came in. That tells you that this policy had no, no grounding in reality. But it was a policy that pretty much had to happen because we had the building blocks in place. Once you label a state a rogue nation, once you call it a state sponsor of terror, once you say it has weapons of mass destruction, once you sanction it, and then once you put no-fly zones in, the rest of the story has already been written. Gaddafi had to go. And this was what Hillary Clinton pushed as Secretary of State. She pushed a policy of regime change that mirrored, in every sense of the word, the regime change building blocks that we had used against Iraq. We used the same building blocks, maybe a little variation here and there, to go against Libya. Now, here's the problem. What did Bernie Sanders do when a sense of the Congress vote was taken about Libya? He voted in favor of the imposition of a no-fly zone. Why? Because Bernie, like any American politician, is about the red meat. If you're explaining, you're losing. Gaddafi has been painted as a brutal dictator. Bernie Sanders' first words: Muammar Gaddafi is a brutal dictator who has to go. He has weapons of mass destruction. They have to be removed. He is a threat, an ugly threat. But again, Sanders' position was we needed to go to the United Nations, we need to get international support, we need to do it the right way. He never had a chance to vote against the Libya action because when the Senate finally had an opportunity to bring it up to vote, the vote got canceled through some parliamentarian actions, delays by the Republicans trying to link the vote to some budgetary issues. So we'll really never really know truly how Bernie Sanders felt in the summer of 2011. He says that he was aligned against the military intervention. The problem is his voting record in the spring of 2011 doesn't back that. He supported the imposition of a no-fly zone that led to the disaster we have today. Now, Barack Obama has called Libya his greatest mistake. And the architect of Libya was Hillary Clinton. So I don't think we need to spend too much time talking about who's to blame for Libya. But Hillary Clinton is a mainstream politician. Hillary Clinton is a mainstream national security advocate. Bernie's putting himself as somebody who's not mainstream, who walks to a different drum. But the problem is when we take a look at his record on Iran or on Iraq and Libya, he's pretty much in step. He's pretty much in step, and this is bothersome. So now we come to part 3, Syria. Hillary's record on Syria is quite clear. She's labeled the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, a rogue leader. Syria is a state sponsor of terror. Syria possesses weapons of mass destruction. Hillary's in favor of sanctioning Syria. We are sanctioning Syria. And Hillary wants to impose a no-fly zone. What did that tell you is going to happen in Syria if Hillary has her way? There'll be yet another American-led intervention leading to regime change. The problem is, though, that Syria is falling apart. The American policy of Syria is falling apart under the weight of its own lies. If you go to 2011, in the start of the Syrian civil war, the narrative that's being played out is that Bashar al-Assad brutally suppressed a peaceful rising of the Syrian public. I would ask the people in this audience to take a look at a town in Syria, Jizr al-Sagur, and take a look at what happened in that town from April of 2011 till June of 2011, and tell me if you think that was a peaceful uprising. It was actually a well-funded, well-trained, well-organized jihadist uprising, deliberately targeting the Syrian government. A lot of the lies that we've embraced, that Hillary Clinton and others have embraced about Syria, emerged from the Jizr al-Sagur event. To give you one big one, the Syrian army was defecting in droves to defend the Syrian people from the brutality of Bashar al-Assad. They even went so far as to put a lieutenant colonel, I believe his name is Hamouche, before the international public. And he said, I defected with my men, and we stood in the street, and we held off the Syrian regular army, Bashar's thugs, until the people could flee. And then we fled to Turkey, and we suffered horrendous casualties. The 60 and 70 dead soldiers you saw in the town of Jizr al-Sagur were my soldiers, slaughtered by Bashar al-Assad's people. None of this was true. The BBC finally hunted this guy down, and it turns out he wasn't even in the town at the time. He had defected afterwards. He went to Turkey, and he was brought in, and this was all a fabrication. The 60 or 70 people that were slaughtered were Syrian soldiers from a special intelligence unit, unarmed, who were captured by the Muslim Brotherhood and the jihadists, and then butchered, along with policemen. That was the nature of the peaceful uprising. Now we take a look at, weapons of mass destruction. We're told that Syria used chemical weapons against its own people. That story's already been discounted. The United Nations went in, did inspections, and has shown that the nerve agent that was used in these attacks is not the nerve agent that's associated with the Syrian government. How do we know this? Well, we actually destroyed the Syrian nerve agent. We put it on an American ship, the Cape May, that has a detailed laboratory that basically tested it, and we had the DNA, the chemical equivalent of the DNA of this nerve agent. We know for a fact that the stuff that was used against the Syrian civilians in August of 2013 was not Syrian government nerve agent. More than likely, it was nerve agent that was brought in through Turkey, facilitated by Turkish intelligence, handed over to offshoots of the al-Nusra Front, who then used these to attack civilian populations to create a false flag incident to try and get the United States dragged into this war. But it fell apart. It fell apart because the lies were not sustainable. It also fell apart because Russia intervened. And Russia basically said, rather than go to war, why don't we just get rid of the chemical weapons? John Kerry said, well, we could do that, but Syria will never go along with that. Syria went along with it. Next thing we know, all the chemical weapons are gone, and the narrative fell apart. But what's dangerous about this narrative is that Bernie Sanders continues to eat the red meat. He continues to put forward a narrative that says, for instance, Assad is a horrendous dictator who's been at war with his own people. How do you come up with this statement? First of all, it's because the press has basically said that hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been killed in this civil war. And then they automatically say that the person solely responsible for these deaths is Bashar al-Assad. But if you break down the casualties, you'll find out that closer to 450,000 people have been killed. The vast majority of them, anywhere from 98,000 to 147,000, are Syrian government forces. Another 104,000, 150,000 are rebel forces. So fully 4/5 of the casualties are military casualties. This is not a government slaughtering its own people. This is a nation engaged in a brutal civil war. There are civilians dying. Somewhere around 85,000 civilians have died. Upwards of 20,000 have died at the hands of Syrian government aerial bombardment. This is a horrible statistic. It's tragic. But you know, when we invaded Normandy on June 6, 1944, we lost 4,400 people. Americans, British, Canadians, French soldiers on the beaches that day. Over 1,000 Germans were killed. But what's not talked about are the 6,000 Frenchmen and women and children who died that same day as a direct result of the fighting. Civilians die during wartime. It is a tragic reality. It doesn't mean that Bashar al-Assad is butchering them. It means that a horrible war is taking place and civilians are caught in the crossfire. Or if you want a more modern example, let's talk about the Battle of Fallujah. American forces fighting in Iraq. 107 Americans and allies were killed in the fighting that took place over the course of several months. Around 1,500 insurgents were killed. Nearly 1,000 civilians died in that fighting as well. Now that's a casualty rate that's even greater percentage-wise than what we see taking place in Syria today. That's just one battle, one urban battle. Urban battles being fought over and over again in Syria. And yet we condemn Bashar al-Assad for waging the exact same kind of war that we waged in Iraq. But for us, the civilian casualties are legitimate collateral consequence of legitimate war. Bernie has said that Assad is killing his own people. It's not true. Bernie's eating the red meat. He says his use of chemical weapons is abhorrent and violative of international law. But we now know that Assad didn't use chemical weapons. Bernie says that Assad must depart in order for there to be a solution to the Syrian conflict. But why does Assad need to go? He only needs to go because America's come up with this building block formulation of interventionism and regime change that Bernie Sanders has embraced. Fortunately for Bernie Sanders, the lies about Syria are collapsing, and he may be in a position, if elected, to reverse course. If Hillary's elected, we know what she's going to do. Impose a no-fly zone that will lead to direct military intervention, the desires of regime change. It'll be the exact same formula we used in Iraq and in Libya, played out again in Syria. The last one, though, the one that gives me hope, is Iran. As with Libya, since 1990, we've been demonizing the Iranians. We've been sanctioning them. We've been accusing them of having weapons of mass destruction. We've been accusing them of being state sponsors of terror. There was a real danger a couple years ago that during the Bush administration that we might actually have military intervention in Iran over its nuclear program. The United States went overboard in pitching the Iranian nuclear program as a military threat, as an actual nuclear weapons program. But it couldn't sustain itself. The lies could not be sustained, and it collapsed in its own weight. And what we have today is a nuclear agreement between Iran and the rest of the world that has resolved its nuclear issue. And if you think about it for a second, it's quite remarkable. We had pitched a nuclear agreement as being a genuine, the Iranian nuclear threat as being a nuclear weapons threat. We said they had a nuclear weapons capability. We pointed to American intelligence estimates that said they have an active nuclear weapons capability. We sold a bill of goods to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations inspectors, saying these guys have possible military dimension stuff. They have stuff going on that's very suspicious, and it's stuff that we have to be willing to go to war to stop if they won't disarm. But Iran didn't play that game. Iran kept saying, we're going to have our peaceful nuclear program. And at the end of the day, the United States was forced to recant. Overnight, the PMI issue, or PMD issue, the possible military dimension issue, went from being a reason to go to war to being a non-issue, because the United States was willing to just write it off. Hillary Clinton brags about how she pushed for economic sanctions and how sanctions drove Iran to the table. The opposite's the truth. Sanctions drove the United States to the table. You see, the longer we had sanctions, the bigger the Iranian program was. When we first started sanctioning them about their nuclear program, there weren't any centrifuges. Then in 2002, 2003, there was 186 or so centrifuges. We kept telling the Iranians, you have to stop. They kept saying no. By the time, this time, a year and a half ago, there was nearly 20,000 centrifuges spinning, and Iran was getting ready to build even more. It wasn't Iran that was forced to the negotiating table. It was the United States that was forced to the negotiating table. The United States changed its position. Its position under Hillary Clinton was not one single centrifuge will be allowed in Iran. She left as Secretary of State, John Kerry came in, and instantly we got a new position, which is Iran will be allowed to have a peaceful nuclear program inclusive of a uranium enrichment capability. American policy collapsed under the weight of its own lies. And this is a good thing, because guess who voted in support of the Iranian nuclear accord? Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders voted in support of it. And this shows that this is a man, while he's as human as the rest of us and as American as the rest of us and capable of eating the red meat, is also capable of seeing through the lies and doing the right thing. So when you take a look at the two candidates today, I think we have a stark choice. We have a choice of more of the same, a continuation of Iraq, Libya, and Syria, or we have the ability to change course and bring somebody in who, although in the past was a facilitator of American policies of intervention, has shown that when it comes time for actual implementation, he's able to tack us away from a policy of confrontation. And I think these are the two stark choices we have when taking a look at these candidates today. Sorry for speaking so long, and I'll turn it over to Ray. Thank you.
Well, I too want to welcome you all for coming. There's no mic here, so if you can't hear me in the back, please raise your hand and I'll speak louder. It's my privilege to be up here with these two straight shooters. I was delighted that Mark Crispin Miller helped us so much in getting this hall, in liaising with the church here, a very hospitable church, and I want to thank them on the record. I also want to read, at my earliest opportunity, Cruel and Unusual, the book that Mark has written. I haven't read that yet, but I keep learning new things about Mark and about Scott, and I learned a couple tonight. Let me just say in a kind of a broad sense, a kind of a keynote sense, that Mark is particularly interesting and important because of what he does with respect to the media. Now, I just celebrated last week my 53rd anniversary of my arrival in Washington. Okay, John Kennedy was president. I had a new job with the CIA, detailed from the military. So I say that because 53 years is a long time, and you see a lot of change in 53 years, don't you? Well, there's one change that dwarfs all the other changes put together in this 53-year period, and that is that we no longer have, in any real sense, a free media, and that is big. That couldn't be bigger. All of my colleagues, the people I went to Fordham with for 4 years, for 8 years, sometimes for 9 years, they don't know about me because I say things that aren't in the New York Times. Can you believe it? Well, they can't believe it if it's not in the New York Times. Now, that's big. It didn't used to be that way. When I referred to the New York Times, historically, I have to say, well, it used to be an independent newspaper, and it did. You could leak stuff or you tell stuff to the New York Times, they put it on the front page after they proofed it. Now, well, if it might hurt George W. Bush's re-election chances, well, they'll sit on it for over a year, as they did with the news they had of the interception program of all our emails and telephone calls. You know, that journalist had that information 2 months before the election in 2004. The Times sat on it. And they only published it, James Rison's stuff, they only published it when Rison went to them and said, now, you know, it's a little awkward. My book is in galley. You're paying me big bucks, and it's going to be a little embarrassing when the book comes out and you haven't reported that Bush, Cheney, and the NSA are intercepting all our telephone conversations and our emails. So I just want to go on record as saying that, because that changes everything in terms of what I was used to in the old days, let's say. The Scud story. Here's a new thing I learned tonight. Scott and I were having a pizza not too far away from here, and Mark told us that he was going to tell the story about the Scuds, none of which were destroyed. Well, General Schwarzkopf was very, very angry that none were destroyed, so he was wanting to make sure that some were destroyed, and sure enough, he announced to the press, we got several of them, we just destroyed them. And the way it came to me out of Colin Powell's book was some junior imagery analyst said, no, those were oil tankers. And Schwarzkopf's intelligence guy, Admiral, what's his name, the guy who became McConnell, McConnell went to Schwarzkopf and said, well, you know, this troublesome analyst says they're oil tankers. And so that got to the White House, and Powell called up Schwarzkopf and said, General Schwarzkopf, we hear from the bowels of your unit there that they weren't Scuds, that they were oil tankers. Now, Powell says that Schwarzkopf used every vulgar, every piece of cursing that Powell ever said, and Schwarzkopf said, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. They were Scuds. And so Powell, no profile in courage, Powell said, oh, all right, you say they were Scuds? They were Scuds. Next day, front page of the New York Times, pictures of these oil tankers, these Jordanian oil tankers destroyed at the place where the Scuds were supposed to be. So I said to Scott, chewing on a pizza, I said, I don't know who that guy was, but, he spoke the truth. I wonder what happened to him. And guess what Scott said to me? Guess, anybody?
He was fired.
Yeah, what?
You're eating pizza with him.
Yeah, that's what he said. You're eating pizza with him. And I said, well, what happened, Scott? He said, well, you got fired, right? Yeah, on the spot, You tell the truth, you get fired. And we all are familiar with that. Now, this leads me to the next little test of Scott's character and my naivete. We're talking about Hillary Clinton. It wasn't a mistake, folks. It wasn't a mistake that had her vote for the Iraq War. It was a calculated, cynical, political move because she knew that she had to be tough if she was to get her turn to be President of the United States. She didn't want to know any of this stuff. She didn't want to know any of the truth. And, we have that. Example A. 4 weeks before the attack on Iraq in March of 2003, somebody leaked the debriefing report that was taken from Hussein Kamel, one of Saddam Hussein's sons-in-law. Okay, he defected to Jordan, and in 1955 he spilled the beans. CIA, British, UN interrogators, they said, well, thanks for coming out. Now, where are the weapons of mass destruction? And Hussein Kamel said, well, they were all destroyed. Interrogators, right. How do you know they were destroyed? Well, you didn't do your research? You don't know that I was in charge of that program? Yeah, but how do you know they were destroyed? Well, I don't know how it works in the West, but I was in charge of that program, right? And I ordered them destroyed, so they were destroyed, okay? Yeah, how do you know? Well, I've checked some samples. What do you want me to say, that they weren't? Is that what you want? You want me to say they're still there, Well, they're not. They're destroyed. It's all in this beautiful debriefing report. Somebody leaked that to Newsweek 4 weeks, actually 5 weeks, before the attack on Iraq. What did the media do? Well, Newsweek put it in a little periscope. Remember the little periscope part of the, just a small little item there? It certainly deserved more, but to their credit, they published a story. This was at the end of February 2003, and the stenographers, who used to be called journalists that we have in Washington, they said, "Oh my, this is not the narrative. We better check this out." So where would you go to check that out? Anyone? Oh, they went to the CIA, right? And the CIA guy said, "Well, no, it's bogus, untrue, it's false," and one of the adjectives they used here. False, untrue, wrong, bogus. So they pulled out the whole tray of adjectives that they use for really serious occasions. And what did the stenographers of the mainstream press do? Well, they said, "Oh, thanks so much, because we were thinking of writing a story on this. So thanks for telling us that it was bogus, untrue, and all this stuff." Now, that was out there, right? It was documentary. It was the debriefing report. I said to Scott several years ago, I said, "I don't know who did that, who gave that to Newsweek, but that was the last great chance to stop this damn war." Guess what Scott told me? Anyone? It was me. So there's no end to the truth-telling character of this guy. He tried his best to stop this darn war. You haven't told the story about trying to see Hillary, but we'll get into that a little bit later, I hope. But look, Hillary could have found out. Bob Graham. Now, whatever you say about Bob Graham, he was the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, right? And he voted against the war. He saw the information. He may have been one of the 4 people who went down and read the estimate dated October 1st, which said, Saddam Hussein has all manner of weapons of mass destruction. He's a threat to everyone, and besides, there's a sinister nexus, your word, between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, okay? Yeah, well, that wasn't true, but she didn't even read it, okay? Hillary Clinton didn't read it. Now, we talked about Syria here. I'm just going to sow seriatim here because we want to do a lot of questions and answers. Syria is really big. Barack Obama feels real proud of Syria. Why? Because he didn't let himself get mousetrapped. Scott just kind of mentioned that in passing, but this is a real interesting case study, if you will, if you want to do the Harvard Business School approach. Here's the case, all right? Saddam has to go. Who says? Hillary says. Who says? Barack Obama says. Okay.
Bush says.
What does he have?
Israel says.
What?
Netanyahu says.
Yeah, Netanyahu. Yeah, well, that's what I'm getting to. So why does he have to go?
Says.
Why does he have to go? Because?
Not the front man who cares about that.
Because who else says?
George W. Bush says it.
Yeah, and Netanyahu.
Cheney says.
There was a very interesting slip that the New York Times made in October, first week of October 5th, actually, of 2013. What happened was this. There was a false flag attack, and the President of the United States was almost mousetrapped. Now, why was he almost mousetrapped? Well, because someone told one of the stenographers of the Washington Press to ask a question at a press conference of the president, who said, "We're not going to get military involved in Syria." And so the answer was, at the end, it was a very canned answer. It clearly came from Hillary Clinton. The question was, under what conditions would you change your military calculus here? Under what conditions would you attack Syria? And he, as though reading it from rote, said, "Well, if Bashar al-Assad moved or used chemical weapons, then I would change my calculus, and then we might do a military thing." Well, now a year later, all of a sudden, there's this attack outside Damascus, just incidentally, as UN inspectors come into Damascus to look at what's happened there. And what was it? It was blamed on Bashar al-Assad. Scott has already given the answer to this story. It wasn't Bashar al-Assad. It was the rebels. It was the rebels enforced, or reinforced, and facilitated by the Turkish intelligence service and other Western operatives working with the al-Nusra Front and others in southern Syria. So what happens? Well, a couple of people are killed with this sarin attack. But as Scott has already said, it's not the sarin that's in Syrian army stocks. It's a homemade sarin, okay? Who told us that first? The foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov. He said, it's homemade stuff. Who told us second? The British. They took it through their lab and said, no, this is homemade stuff. And then, of course, as Scott said, on the ship, they got the DNA of this stuff. So what was the idea? The idea was to mousetrap Barack Obama. Who did it? Hillary Clinton, by placing that dare, that red line into that press conference. And then a year later, they got their act together and they did a false flag attack. And Barack Obama was hours away from pushing the button, letting fly all manner of missiles to attack with shock and awe Syria. Why is he so proud of not doing that? Well, I think he's sensible enough to know that he was about to be had. Why does he get rid of Hillary Clinton? Why doesn't Barack Obama get rid of all these creeps that he's had advising him? He tried to be Lincoln, and he fall flat in his face with this, cooperation of people who are supposed to. Anyhow, this is a really interesting story because John Kerry, like Hillary Clinton, was in on it. That is, in on the subterfuge up to his neck. The sarin attack, was on the 21st of August, 2013. John Kerry got up on the 30th of August at the State Department in a briefing, and he said no fewer than 35 times, Bashar al-Assad's responsible for this, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's government, all right? Okay. Now, you don't have to be a Shakespearean scholar to remember about protesting too much, right? What did he cite? He couldn't cite an intelligence assessment because there are enough honest analysts left in the intelligence community that wouldn't buy it, okay? So he created a new genre of report, a government assessment, which simply means it was made by political hacks in the White House, and that the head of intelligence didn't have the guts to quit. So this is what Kerry cited. That was the 30th of August. On the 31st, the president got in the Rose Garden. And this was really interesting because I was out in front of the White House with about 100 other people, well, 200 other people, with all kinds of placards, no war, no strike on Syria, this kind of thing. And we fully expected the president to get up and say, even as I speak, our warships in the Eastern Mediterranean and French fighter bombers on the tarmac, and blah, 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 blah. No. What did he say? I couldn't believe it. He said, we've decided that we're going to listen to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey. He's told me that we have our forces in position to attack Syria, but we don't have to do that today or tomorrow or even next week or next month. And so I'm going to go to Congress to seek appropriate authorization. Oh, God, wow. I was the next speaker up at this little rally, and I had to use the subjunctive as never before. If this is true, if he really said that, but he did, okay? So he's very happy. He's very proud of that. And what does that mean? That means he realized that he was almost had by the likes of Hillary Clinton. Now, it's amazing that he's also admitted, as recently as last week, that, if he got a mulligan, if he got a do-over, it would be Syria, That wasn't a really smart thing. He said, we just didn't plan for the next day. Well, hello? Where was he during Iraq, Who didn't plan for the next day? Is that the president's job? Well, he should have somebody who could plan for the next day. And who was that? That was Hillary Clinton. No, she didn't plan for the next day. We came, we saw, he died. That's all she cared about, being tough, okay? So that's what you're going to get if you, her successor, John Kerry, is a real study. I don't know what happened to him. He has a long history, but something really strange happened to him because he became a neocon. He pushed for the attack on Iraq, on Syria, just as all the others did. And the president's very proud of that. He says, you know, Vice President Biden and everybody else was really disappointed with me for not attacking Syria. Now, question was raised before, well, why Syria? You know, what kind of a threat is Syria to the United States? Well, the answer is none. Is Syria regarded as a threat to somebody else? Well, the answer is yes. Who's that somebody else? Israel. And during this period of time, when the president had said, no, we're not going to attack, there was a new New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief named Jody Ruderin. And she arrived a couple months before, and she was eager to find these things out. So she thought she'd speak to some Israeli officials about, you know, what their objectives are in Syria. And so she went around. She talked to some senior officials, including retired officials, and she said, "Well, what's your preferred outcome in Syria?" And they said, "Well, Jody, this is going to sound like not very." It's a little awkward and it's not humanitarian, I suppose, but our preferred outcome is no outcome. And she said, I beg your pardon? Our preferred outcome is no outcome. And she said, would you explain that, you know? I said, well, as long as the Shia and Sunni are at each other's throats, not only in Syria, mind you, but in the whole area, Israel has nothing to fear from Syria. It's like a playoff game where you don't want either team to win and you don't want either team to lose. Well, hello, what was happening in the spring of 2013? Bashar al-Assad was starting to win. He had dislodged some of these ragtag rebels from places they had occupied for a couple of years. And so what needed to change? What needed to change the calculus? Get the U.S. in, mousetrap them into overt military involvement, and then it's still not going to win, but at least Bashar al-Assad's not going to win. That's how cruel and calculating that calculus was. So, last thing here, I started to talk about Kerry. He went before Congress on the 3rd of September, 3 days after all this went down, and he told Congress, you know, we have to get your permission, we have to get your acknowledgement that we have to attack Bashar al-Assad, and besides, the moderates are winning, the moderates are winning, and everybody in Washington went, the moderates are winning. The president says there aren't. The president told Tom Friedman the notion that there are moderates in Syria, moderate rebels, is a fantasy. Fantasy, okay? And here John Kerry is saying the moderates are winning. Next day, Barack Obama arrives in St. Petersburg for one of these little summits. And that same day, Vladimir Putin, in an open meeting, said, you know, this fellow John Kerry, он врет, он знает, что врет, это печально, which means he lies, он знает, что he knows he's lying. This is really sad. Barack Obama lands, and Putin says this. Well, Barack Obama knows the real story too, so he wasn't going to argue with him. Kerry was lying. Now, Kerry is on his way home 5 days later from London, and he has a press conference in London. This came up before. At the end of the press conference, where she's plugging for military attack on Syria, somebody says, but Secretary Kerry, is there nothing that Bashar al-Assad can do to avoid being attacked? And before the cameras, Kerry says, well, I mean, It could let all his chemical weapons be destroyed, but that's not in the card. That's not going to happen, you know. He gets on the plane, call from the president. John, I meant to mention this to you, but I've been talking with Putin, and we've arranged to have all the Syrian chemical weapons destroyed under our supervision, UN supervision. So when you come back, I want to see you right away, because I'm going to send you back to Geneva to conclude this deal. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen a Secretary of State say, having been cut out of the calculus there. Obama knew he had to go behind Kerry's back to get this done. He did it with Putin. They got the Syrian foreign minister to say, oh yeah, that's fine, sure, destroy all our chemical weapons. And you know, what Kerry had just said 2 days before, that's not going to happen. That's not in the cards. Of course, it happened. So this is the kind of thing that not only Hillary Clinton, but the people in the State Department, and specifically her successor, Kerry, that's the way they acted. Now, I want to say something, there's lots more to say here, but I want to talk about the email thing. Now, Bernie Sanders won great applause, including mine, when he said, I'm sick and tired of hearing about damn emails. Enough with the emails, all right? Well, that was a pretty grandiose, sort of grandfatherly, nice little gesture. But whether he knew it or not, he was dead wrong. That is very, very serious stuff. Now, Scott and I, maybe Mark, we know a little bit more about how this works. But putting that kind of stuff on a private email server is like giving it to the Russians. Who was it? One of my colleagues, Bill Binney, the head technology guy from the NSA, said it's just like having a mole at the top levels of your government. It's easy as pie to get this stuff. And this is very, very dangerous stuff. When you talk about, they said, well, Bradley Manning, he endangered our troops in Afghanistan. Well, that was a lot of bull. Bobby Gates and all the others said, yes, there's a great danger to our troops. And Carl Levin, the head of the Senate Armed Services Committee, to his credit, said, well, would you give me a memo on that, Secretary Gates? And Gates did, and 5 weeks later he came back, well, our fears were not substantiated. No one has been, he didn't say it this way, but no one had been so much as spat upon, as a result of these emails. And Gates later asked publicly, he said, well, those stories about endangering troops from what Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning revealed were significantly overwrought. Gates has a way with words. Those were his words. They were significantly overwrought. Well, the comparison here is devastating because the damage done by virtue of Hillary Clinton putting this stuff on a private server is incalculable in many ways and endangers troops. Now look, Kerry was flying into Kabul last week. The Taliban took a couple pot shots at him, okay? Now this is very secret stuff. The president comes in the middle of the night to Baghdad and says hello to the troops and then they gets right out. Well, you put that on a server and the Taliban and other people will down that plane. Next Secretary of State will pay the price. And think about the blackmail potential. Think about it. You don't have to be kind of paranoid. Think about that. Now, people have the book on Hillary Clinton. They know who funded the Clinton Foundation. They know about conversations with Prince Bandar. They know all manner of things. So she is, in my view, eminently susceptible of blackmailing by people who know exactly how she arranged to get all these things done and how, as Secretary of State, for the most part, she was able to parlay her position into personal profit. Now, truth in advertising or full disclosure, I try not to let the fact that I got beat up real bad sitting right in front of, or standing, I should say, right in front of Hillary Clinton, But just to give you an idea of how, well, sang-froid is not really the not really the right term. I'd say it's a lack of basic human empathy with human suffering. Because what I did when she was speaking 5 years ago at George Washington University, I wangled a ticket. And I'll finish with this. I just want to say what happened. I had to hear her because it was a small little auditorium. This is the only chance McGovern gets to see a Secretary of State. I used to see him every other morning, right? Secretary Schultz and others. It was kind of fun. I still have my State Department badge. It doesn't work anymore, but at least I would have a chance to see Hillary Clinton speak. So we're waiting there for an hour, and she was supposed to be there at 12:15. She comes 20 minutes late. As she comes in, everyone just jumps up, including me. And you know how the Russians, when they made a speech in Pravda the next day, after every other paragraph, the speech would say, "Бурные аплодисменты, всё стоят," which means stormy applause, everyone stands. Okay? And I'm saying, oh, I'm having a flashback. See? I'm saying, oh my God, so why are you standing, McGovern? So finally everybody sits down, and I stay standing. And I turn my back to her. And by stroke of luck, the only clean undershirt I had that day was my Veterans for Peace undershirt. So I took off my over thing, and I was just standing there quietly. And all of a sudden, I guess after about a minute and a half, when things seemed to be going well, this great big guy, looked like a Redskins reject, you know, about 300 pounds, in a suit like this. He comes down, and he's come down this aisle and says, oh, darn, you know, this is not going to last very long. And then all of a sudden, before he even got 2 feet in front of me, I was taken down from the back by a guy I never saw. He happened to have a uniform on. He was one of the cops for GW University. I never saw him. I never even saw him after they got out and put 2 sets of steel Anyhow, she was standing there, and people say, well, what was she talking about? Well, she was talking about the need to respect dissent in Iran. I know, in Iran, right? And did she miss? People say she didn't miss a word, you know. Well, she didn't miss a syllable. And Amy Goodman, to her, she's got a heart, you know. She had Mike Burke call me up and say, hey, would you come on a couple of days? Are you okay? And I said, yeah, I'm all right. So I went on, and there's a 5-minute thing. Now let me just ask you before I bore you with this. How many people have seen this 5-minute thing where I explained to Amy Goodman what happened? Because I don't want to show it again if many have seen it.